So today I'm going to tell you guys what I do for the David Horowitz Freedom Center, and it is specifically related to the Stop K-12 Indoctrination program. Now, before I get into this and all the specifics about what's going on in our public school education, I do want to talk about how I started and how I first got involved with this program. And where this all started for me was with the EDINA school district. On February 3rd, 2019, I published a video. That's supposed to say 2018. On February 3rd, 2018, I published a video about a specific school district in Minnesota that used to be the #1 school district throughout the state. It was called the EDINA School District. However, in 2013, they decided that they were going to switch over the curriculum to what they called an all-for-all curriculum, because they had the noble goal of closing the achievement gap. But after 4 years under this new program, the EDINA School District was no longer the #1 school district in Minnesota. Because it turns out, what an all-for-all curriculum meant in EDINA was that they would put an extreme focus on a social justice curriculum, which included teaching children as young as first grade, or actually as young as kindergarten, about their white privilege. They did exercises like the Melanin hands exercise, where children were instructed to draw their hands on a piece of paper, color it in as it is, according to their skin color, and then post it up on a bulletin board. And the bulletin board read, "Your skin color does not make you superior to anybody else," because one of the fatal conceits of this program is that all of our children, as young as kindergarten, are already racist, and you need to deprogram them from the racism that they already have. Now, another aspect of this program was that they replaced traditional American authors. So Mark Twain, gotta go. Any Dr. Seuss doesn't belong in our schools anymore. And they would replace it with books like the one that you see right here. And it's a book that I actually have brought with me called A is for Activism. Now I'm gonna hand this out, and I hope that everybody will get to see it. I'll start right here. Pass it around your table, open it up, take a look. A for Activism is essentially a book that seeks to teach the ABCs in accordance with specific activist causes. So A obviously is for activism. C would be for counter to corporate culture or counter to corporate values. U would be for unions, of course. W is also for unions, but eventually it goes over a few leftist causes and then becomes for workers' rights. And it's not just the curriculum that they show to these little kids, like this kind of exercise. All of the staff who worked in the school were required to take diversity training in order to aid them in dismantling white privilege. And that extended, hilariously enough, to bus drivers. Because, the people who drive your children to and from schools that may or may not say a word to your children the entire school year are somehow reinforcing white supremacy. Because, of course they are. Now, it would be one thing if the new curriculum produced the results that was intended. But as you'll learn by going over these social justice type curriculums, they actually, of course, hurt students. And when you think about it, it's not illogical that these curriculums would hurt students. Because when you tell all of your minority students that the reason they're not doing well is because their white students are oppressing them and the system is rigged against them, and there's essentially no way for them to succeed in the United States of America because the entirety of the country is rigged against them, you can't expect them to have positive results. Now, we went over the early education stuff with the A is for Activism book. Another thing that I would like to bring up to your guys' attention is what the 10th grade reading class was about, and I'm sure many of you can see it, but if you can't, I'll read it out loud. So a 10th grade reading class stopped being about reading, and it became about undermining colonialism, immigration, and social constructions of race, class, and gender. Because that's what your kids need to learn instead of reading. 11th grade, or the purpose of an 11th grade course in reading, was to apply Marxist, feminist, and post-colonial and psychoanalytical theories and lenses to literature. One of the things that we found by doing this story was a Rate My Teacher post. And it was from a student, and they basically described their course as why white males are bad and how oppressive they are. Needless to say, the school ended up taking down that post, but we archived it, so I assure you it did in fact exist. Now, the results of this were tragic. The 11th grade math scores for African American students, the very people that this curriculum was designed to help, were cut by more than half. Black students fell from 31% proficient in 2013 when EDINA was the #1 school district in the state of Minnesota to 14%. 11th grade, I don't know if you guys, I assume many of you guys are parents. 11th grade is probably the most important year when children are applying for college. So having your math scores cut by more than half, not the best thing to do for your child's future. 10th grade reading, which was the curriculum that we described as why white males are bad and why they're oppressing everybody, fell by over 10%. So again, this curriculum is not effective. It is indoctrination from the moment they enter school in kindergarten all the way to the point of graduation. And there's no justification for it in my mind. Now, I made this video. I uploaded it onto my YouTube channel. And like I do normally on my YouTube channel, or like I did normally on my YouTube channel, I thought that was the end of it. But then David Horowitz contacted me. And he said, Sean, you need to call me, because he contacted me via email first. So he called me and he asked me to do this series repeatedly, to go over different school districts across the nation, whether they be individual examples of teachers, of unions influencing curriculum, or of the entire statewide curriculum, and make condensed videos to explain this to the public. So when I discovered this, I didn't know it was a nationwide problem, but I think it's important to highlight the first example that I found out to know that this is not something that's outside the norm. This is the norm. And if it's not the norm where in your school district, it soon will be. So the Freedom Center has broken this process down into 3 categories. They say it's radicalism, revisionism, and revolution. Obviously, there's a lot of radicals throughout our K-12 indoctrination system. That's the only way things like this can come to pass. Revisionism, changing history, basically framing our founding fathers as nothing more than slave owners, nothing more as racist bigots, saying that the United States is founded on racism, and revolution. A lot of these curriculums promote socialism. Kind of giving away the game here, but that's what the end goal of a lot of these curriculums are. Now I have a quick question for people in this room. How many of you would identify, just by a show of hands, as Christians? That's a lot of Christians. I don't think you're going to like this next slide. So, this comes from the Santa Barbara Unified School District. It is a curriculum put together by Just Communities. I know a lot of you may have heard about the recent statewide California curriculum that was struck down due to public backlash. But just because it was struck down on the statewide level doesn't mean that these types of curriculums aren't already in place in local school districts. Now, this chart describes who are the oppressors, what is the type of oppression, and who are the victims of that oppression. Now, the reason I took a little informal poll to figure out how many of you guys are Christians is you can see on the bottom, there's the category of religious oppression, and the oppressors, or the people in the privileged group, are Christians. And apparently, all of you, according to this curriculum, are oppressing all other religious groups. All of them. Without exemption. Now, if you look over this chart, and you guys can look it up, if you find my video series on this, or if you ask me about it, I will point you to the direction where you can find a paper copy of this chart. You will see that men are obviously oppressing women. White people are obviously oppressing everybody who is not white. If you are heterosexual, you are oppressing the LGBTQ community. If you identify as the gender you were born, you are oppressing everybody who's transgender. Classism, if you guys have a lot of money, you're oppressing the poor, obviously. Like, again, socialism worked in there. And if you're able-bodied, you're oppressing the disabled. And if you are between the ages of 18 and 65, you are oppressing both the children and the elders. By the way, one of the forms of oppression for the children in this Just Communities curriculum is the fact that we don't let 13-year-olds, as an example, vote in our elections. Which I guess we should. Now, one of the things that I found absolutely interesting about the Just Communities curriculum is that they're actually not in favor of public education. They describe public education as a capitalist conspiracy to limit the education that, I guess, the people in the lower classes can have so that they can be only useful as sufficient workers in their factories or whatever companies that they end up being employed at. You are also an oppressor no matter what. So whether you are deliberately targeting somebody, you're an oppressor, which obviously that one makes sense. If you are not targeting somebody, then you are unconsciously targeting them, and thus you are an oppressor. And if you try to remain neutral and you literally do nothing, you are also an oppressor through your inaction. White people specifically are, in one part of the curriculum, are described as people who lack empathy by your very nature. In fact, the reason that you lack empathy is because the United States of America, according to this curriculum, is one of the most racist countries on earth. And if any of you had empathy at all, again, according to this curriculum, that would not be the case. By the way, there's no way around this. I looked over this curriculum. There's no out that you can possibly have. This is just how it is, and this is how the students at Santa Barbara schools learn about the world. Now, I'd like to move on because we just went over how Christians are oppressing everybody, and I want to move on to one of the oppressed groups, and that, of course, is the Muslims. Now, just by show of hands, if you proposed a law or put into a curriculum anything that required students to participate in a Christian prayer, how could, do you guys think, just hands for yes, no hands for no, yes or no, would the ACLU file a lawsuit in half a day? Well, right now what you're looking at is a quote-unquote calligraphy exercise. And I don't read Arabic. I assume many of you don't. But what this exercise wants children to do is write out this phrase to the best of their ability. This phrase translates to, there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is the prophet of Allah. It's an affirmation of Islamic faith. And students are required to do this, just as a normal exercise. Now, this comes from a policy called Access to Islam. Now, it started under the George Bush administration after the Iraq War because the Bush administration felt that students in the United States of America should know about people that we are engaged in conflicts with, which honestly I think makes a lot of sense. However, when Obama took over this program, he greatly expanded it. And now students are learning what can only be described as religious indoctrination for Islam. No other religion gets the treatment that Islam gets in our public schools. You can't teach any religious values the same way you can teach Islam in our public schools. Students learn about the 5 pillars of Islam in our public schools. If you wanted to teach them about the Holy Trinity or any of the crucial things about Christian faith, it wouldn't happen. You guys all know that. I saw the hands. Like, I don't need to explain that part to you. But what's interesting is how Islam gets into our public schools. And one of the organizations that gets Islam into our public schools is CAIR. And the trick that CAIR does is that they'll send a letter to a school district that has a reasonably large Muslim minority student population. And in that letter, they'll say, we have a lot of reports of Islamophobic bullying, not just from the students, but also from the teachers. Now, most people would notice, I would think, if teachers were bullying students based on their religious beliefs. And honestly, a lot of people in this room, I would assume everybody in this room, would be against that if that was occurring. But the school districts that complied with CAIR and their demands and instituted CAIR's preferred curriculum around Islam, for the most part, didn't hear about any of these bullying incidents or the vast majority of these bullying incidents before CAIR contacted them. Because, and the implication is that CAIR is probably making these up or exaggerating them. Maybe they'll take one incident or not, and they'll play on the better angels of our nature, our desire to stop bullying, to work Islam into our curriculum. So we already went over that CAIR contacts schools about bullying. They also offer to assist in resolving these issues. And this offer is not just a kind offer to help everybody out. This offer also comes attached with the implication that you will be sued for discrimination if you do not comply with their offer. Now, they do workshops, and these workshops promote identity-specific safe spaces for Muslims. So essentially, CAIR advocates, as one of the ways to deal with Islamic bullying, is to segregate out Muslim students so that they can work on their faith in our public schools on our taxpayer dime. Now, one of my favorite things about doing this is that I don't have to do a lot of guesswork. I don't have to speculate on what people's motives are. I don't have to make things up. I don't have to do anything. What's great about this job is that they tell you exactly what they're doing. So the national director of CAIR, Nihad Awad, admitted in court documents when this was challenged in San Diego that these materials serve religious and educational purposes. Now again, if you told anybody, and you were a Christian or any other faith, that something you were introducing into our public school curriculum served 1% of a religious purpose, it would be thrown out. But CAIR is just allowed to operate. Now, I want to shift from Islam to something else, and just again, show of hands if you see this woman's face and you recognize her, just raise your hand. Oh, we got one person. That's fine, because I'm going to tell you about who this is. So this is Yvette Falarka. Now, you may have recognized her from her appearances on Tucker Carlson. You may be wondering why that clearly looks like a mugshot, and the reason it looks like a mugshot is because Yvette Falarka is a middle school teacher from Berkeley who was arrested for attending violent protest events. Now, I'm not here to deal with anybody's personal political views outside of the classroom, but there's a part of the story that people kind of overlooked with Yvette Falarka, and that's that not only was she a member of BAM, and she was a person who participated in a number of violent protests with, BAM is an offshoot group of Antifa, for those of you who don't know. It stands for By Any Means Necessary. But Yvette Falarka actually recruited her students into these violent protests. And one of the means that she used to recruit those students was to send out fake or fool the school board into thinking that they were taking the kids to a different field trip that actually turned out to be a field trip that was to join BAM. And again, these protests get violent. I encourage you to look up videos of Yvette Falarka and how these protests turn out. They're not the kind of events you want your children going to, especially your children that are in middle school. Now, of course, Yvette, like any great social justice activist who cares deeply about immigrants, targeted immigrant children because their parents didn't speak English and she thought they were easier to fool into thinking that this was a mandatory event. So parents had no idea that she was taking them to these kind of events. Now, Yvette actually dodged a lot of disciplinary actions against her, because even this, in our public schools, was a little bit too much. But the way that she dodged those disciplinary hearings was she had the students that she recruited disrupt the hearings on her behalf. Now, Yvette thankfully was fired, deservedly so, possibly because she went on Tucker Carlson and openly advocated for violence. But we can't expect everybody to go on Tucker Carlson and advocate for violence. We can't expect them to be that dumb and then get fired. Now, Yvette was a teacher in Berkeley, California. I'm sure many of you think Berkeley, California, a pretty liberal place. If this was going to happen anywhere, it would be in Berkeley, California. Well, when Yvette was getting arrested and that video was going viral, people looked into BAM, the organization. And they found that in 2017, 17 candidates for the Detroit Federation of Teachers, that's right here in Michigan, were BAM members. And for the national division, which is the American Federation of Teachers, 5 of these Detroit-based candidates from Detroit were BAM members. A sick out in 2015 was organized by a BAM member where teachers called out sick and 4,000 students had to go without schooling because they had to shut down the schools. But this is my favorite part. Well, it's my least favorite part, but it's the part that you guys need to hear. So they actually interviewed a college student who was a freshman at Western Michigan University. His name was Joe Tabrian. I don't know if I pronounced that right. And he said that he was recruited to BAM at age 11 via a presentation in his public school in Detroit. He was encouraged to join BAM by the American Federation of Teachers and the NEA, and US taxpayers paid for that. Now, it's not just Islam, it's not just violence in our public schools, it's not just books like A is for Activism. Our children are also learning an interesting gender ideology in public schools. So right here, for those of you who can see, you might be thinking that you're looking at a gingerbread man. Now, first of all, that's very judgmental of you. That is a gingerbread person, not a gingerbread man. So, I'm gonna need you all to check your gender privilege for a moment. So students in our public schools across this country are learning college-level gender theory in our public school classrooms. This picture of the gender-bred person is actually something that you can expect to see in your biology classes going forward. Just got quiet in the room for a second. But yeah, so in Fairfax County, Virginia, they actually banned all mentions to biological sex in their public schools. Period. Because obviously that's very oppressive, and you know, what about the less than 1% of transgender students? They're not going to feel very comfortable with that. In fact, they now teach that gender is a spectrum, that sex is a spectrum. And they teach it using things like this. It's not just that specific type of gender ideology that goes on in our public schools. I have a woman's name up here. Her name is Karen Keller. I would recommend that if you're going to write a name down, you write her name down and then you look into her story. Because Karen Keller actually wrote an op-ed about how she treats her kindergartners. And you might also see the word Lego, because Karen Keller decided that it was very problematic that in her kindergarten classroom, that during children's free choice playtime, the boys gravitated toward Legos while the girls gravitated towards different toys. So at first, Karen Keller decided that, first of all, she decided that this was a problem that she needed to fix. So at first she decided that she was going to buy the children more girly colored Legos. So that would be purple, like the light purples, the pinks, and those colors. That didn't really work out for her. So then she decided that she was going to forbid all of her boy students from playing with the toys that they wanted. But that still didn't let the girls gravitate towards the toys that she wanted them to play with. So finally, she set up a Lego club where, and again, she actually wrote this op-ed in her own words, where she described she excluded all the boys from it because she didn't want them playing with the toys. She would always tell them next time throughout the entire school year. And eventually, when she forced the girls to play with the Legos, they played with the Legos. This is a public school teacher. This is what she decided to devote her time to. And not only that, she was proud of it. She wrote an op-ed about it. It's an adult woman bullying children, and she's proud about it. But it's not just Legos. We also have Drag Queen Story Hour. I said Drag Queen Story Hour. So Drag Queen Story Hour is an event that occurs in public libraries. It also occurs privately, where drag queens come to a location and they read stories about gender transition to children. It is a program designed for children ages 3 and up, and often it works on, the program is directed at the children on the lower age spectrum of that. Now, I said Drag Queen Story Hour happens in private spaces and it happens in public libraries, but I'm doing a presentation for Stop K-12 Indoctrination. I don't really care where parents decide to take their children. If you're a bad parent, you can accomplish that all on your own. What I care about is that Drag Queen Story Hour is now making its way into public schools. So, we already have this in New York. This program started in San Francisco, which is the least surprising fact I will tell you this entire night. But we have this in New York, we have this in San Francisco. You guys have this in libraries in Michigan, and soon you guys will have this in public schools too. Now the books that they read are stories about transition and gender non-conforming people. Now, you can see on screen I have a book that says Red, and it shows a red crayon wrapper around a blue crayon. It's a story about a blue crayon that thinks it's red. It's an allegory for gender transition. And these are the kind of books, and I've gone over most of the books that they read in their program. They're all about the same thing, which is gender non-conforming, and it's introducing it to children at a young age. And it has an impact. More kids than ever are identifying as not the gender that they were born. And on top of that, we've seen through study that most of the kids who identify this way, when they grow up, they don't turn out to be transgender. But couple this with the laws that we're all expecting about how you are not allowed to parent your children out of this, and we're essentially creating gender-confused children that eventually you will be legally obligated to seek gender therapy once they report it to you. Now, I do want to tell you all the bad news, but we do have some way of fighting back, something that I'm advocating for. I told you a lot about what I'm against, but I want to tell you a little bit about what I'm for. And that is the Code of Ethics for K-12 educators. Now, I'm not sure if there's a copy of this in one of the pamphlets, but the Code of Ethics for K-12 educators is basically our way of fighting back against this kind of indoctrination. It has 9 pillars, which are the key provisions that guide it, and it starts with basic stuff that you wouldn't think needed to be in a Code of Ethics for teachers, like that they shouldn't be using the captive audience that is their public school classroom to endorse candidates, pieces of legislation, recruit their students to activist groups. But I want to talk a little bit about the 9th aspect of it, and because it used to be 8, just 8. The 9th one prevents segregation and targeting of students based on race, and then blaming one racial group for the failings of other racial groups. Now, the reason this wasn't in the initial draft of the Code of Ethics for K-12 educators was because we thought that should go without saying. It should obviously not be acceptable for teachers to segregate their students based on race and then get racial groups of students to target other racial groups of students. But during the course of the series, because we're learning as much as you guys, I hope, will start to learn after this presentation, we found out that this was incredibly common throughout what we see when we're studying K-12 indoctrination. Now, we don't want to ban all politics from public education because students need to have some way of being informed about the events that are going around in the world. But one of the things that we do want is politics to be constricted to like a current events class. Like, we don't want politics to be discussed in courses that it's not related to. One of the things that we're starting to look into and that's starting to creep up on us is social justice math classes, which I used to love math as a kid because math is the same in every language, and 2 plus 2 always used to equal 4. But now 2 plus 2 isn't about equaling 4. It's about, what does 2 plus 2 tell you about your racial identity? What does 2 plus 2 tell you about your gender identity? So these are the kind of things that we are starting to get into, and we're starting to see more and more. Now, if you want to get involved in our campaign, you can visit stopk12indoctrination.org. I do a video series on my YouTube channel. It's the Stop K-12 Indoctrination video series, but there is way more instances of indoctrination just because it's much more efficient and it's faster to write an article about something than it is for me to put together a video piece about a specific topic. So you can go over, there are hundreds of examples of K through 12 indoctrination across this country that never make my video series because sometimes it's a single incident, sometimes it's something that I don't see, sometimes it's something that works better in written form than it does in video form. We also take tips from parents. So it's a bittersweet kind of thing. So I did an event for the Freedom Center, and I was lucky enough to meet the parent that saw the first video I ever did about the EDINA school district. And she was the one who forwarded my information over to David Horowitz, and she was actually on this way before I even got involved in this. And it was nice to meet somebody that was really passionate about this issue, but it was not so nice to meet somebody who is a working class person who had to basically pull all 4 of her children out of the school district that used to be the best in the country, the school district that she moved to that area to send her children to, because she can clearly see the indoctrination going on. Now, normally, I would wrap the presentation there, but there's a news story that I didn't think was getting enough attention, and we did one video about it, and even that video didn't do particularly well. Now, this is Michigan. It's a swing state, obviously. And just by a show of hands, how many of you have heard about foreign interference in our elections, specifically here or abroad, from the Russians? So I do a lot of my work on the internet and through social media, and yes, there are Russian hackers that did try to interfere with our elections, but a lot of the interference essentially amounts to them purchasing $174,000 worth of ad space on social media and trying to get people angry at each other. It's largely overstated. Obviously, we've seen through a Mueller report that the Trump-Russia thing kind of fell apart as soon as the information came out. But I want to do another show of hands. How many of you have heard about a 2-year-long Senate investigation of foreign interference in our public education system from the Chinese government? There's about 4 people, which is a lot for a room that I'm in. And that's what I want to close with today. You see, because without a code of ethics, without any restrictions, without any guardrails in our public education system, we are not just vulnerable to radical left-wing activists. We are vulnerable to foreign governments, like the Chinese government. So what you're looking at is a logo for the Confucius Institute. And the Senate, I kind of gave away the game a little bit, concluded a 2-year investigation on the Confucius Institute, and they discovered that they are infiltrating our public schools. So, according to the Senate investigation, the Confucius Institute was operating curriculum in 519 K-12 classrooms. Now, the Confucius Institute is also in a ton of colleges across the country. Now, Senator Rob Portman described in the investigative materials the Confucius Institute as operating with a stunning lack of transparency. Teachers who agreed to adopt Confucius Institute programs, and for those of you who don't know, the front for the Confucius Institute is that they offer to do Chinese language classes, so it's hard for us to find ESL teachers or ELL, I don't know what they call it in Michigan, right? I just know the New York version, which is ESL. It's hard for us to find those teachers to help children from China learn English, so they offer those teachers. But they offer those teachers with strings attached. So one of the strings that's attached is that they get everyone who works for the Confucius Institute to sign a contract. And that contract requires these teachers to never, and I mean never, violate the national interests of the Chinese government. Now, that's bad enough as the employees, but it turns out they actually work out similar agreements with individual school districts. They'll offer them a large grant, and those school districts will agree that they will not violate the interests of the Chinese government. They also agree that they will uphold Chinese laws while operating in the United States of America. In fact, the investigation found that 70% of all donations to public schools over $250,000 were not reported as they are legally required to be. So we have school districts across this country receiving over $250,000 in grants with strings attached, and 70% of them aren't reporting it to anybody. So obviously you can't talk about the Chinese human rights records. You have to conscientiously, this is a quote from the investigation, you have to conscientiously safeguard the national interests of China, and that's in the Confucius Institute contract. And another interesting aspect of this was that during the investigation, they discovered 32 different instances of visa fraud in 2018. Now, the people who committed this visa fraud weren't doing, what they did was they said that they were coming here to do research on the collegiate level, but they were working other jobs. Now, they weren't infiltrating our intelligence agencies, they weren't getting secrets about our military, they were working as teachers in our K-12 public schools. By the way, the Confucius Institute does not report back to China's education department, they report back to the intelligence department. So we have foreign infiltrators in our schools. The Confucius Institute operated in the United States of America before this investigation for 15 years. Now we're in the state of Michigan, so I'm guessing a lot of you are wondering how many of these institutions are in the state of Michigan. The answer is 2. They are connected with 2 universities. It actually slipped my mind which ones. But I know, I apologize. But yeah, there are 2 institutions. And to give you an idea of scale, there are about 100 of them nationwide. So 2 is what is to be expected. 2 for every state.
You don't remember the ones that you named at all?
I know they're connected to universities. I just can't remember if it's Michigan, like the University of Michigan, or Michigan State.
It's U of M.
There we go. That's why I can prepare for this, but I'm still not as smart as Google. Thank you for shouting that out. Yeah. So I figured I'd close out with that because I think it's important to know that we're not only talking about the future of our children from a political perspective, we are talking about the future of our children from a national security perspective. The Chinese government is just one foreign government that is operating in our public education system. I assure you there are many more. And when we find them, I will make a video about it. We will put up all the information on stopk12indoctrination.org. Now, I'd like to say that it's time to get in the game. It's time to fight back. But that's not what I want to sign off with, because that doesn't really give the sense of urgency that is needed. It was time to get in the game decades ago. Everybody in this room who's concerned about these issues, you're already losing. It's not even close. If you read the pamphlets, this kind of thing started in our universities and our public education system in the 60s and 70s. It's about a 50-year head start, 60-year head start, if you go by the 60s estimation. So you're losing. They're teaching, they have drag queens coming to your kids' schools. Like, we're past the point where we're talking about traditional gender norms versus a more socially acceptable gender norms. So please, at the end of this, go through our pamphlets, visit stopk12indoctrination.org, read over our code of ethics, see if it's something that you can get behind, and if you are a parent or student, or you have students, or you have children in the public school system, ask them about the curriculum and go over to our tip section and report what you found out. It's not just you. The end.